everyone. Yep, so we're going to start another talk. So we have Professor Waters here. So Paul works in areas around cybersecurity, including governance, risk and compliance, reducing harm online, reducing fraud and scam, as well as teaching online skills. Today, Paul will talk about the recent spate of data breaches in Australia and how a more transparent culture would improve our response. Please welcome Paul.
Thank you. You can clap, it's actually okay. Thank you for that introduction. So before I kind of start my slide deck, and I actually really hate PowerPoint, but I feel like I should have a PowerPoint. I'm gonna just show something and briefly and very selectively read it off. Is that showing or not? No. Okay, well, I'm just going to read it and not show it perhaps. So this is, has everybody here heard of the Optus data breach? Yeah, okay. So immediately 10 seconds in, you can see where the talk is heading, right? So I'm just going to read off a verbatim quote from the Optus CEO, and this is a Channel 9 news report which is entitled "No Victims of Crime or Financial Fraud Due to Optus Cyber Attack," CEO says. And so I'm not going to put words in their mouth, right? I'm just going to read off what they said. And I think just listen really carefully to this. Given how inevitable these types of attacks are, I'm relieved we were able to act fast to ensure that ultimately the data that was exposed was not successfully used to harm any customers. Do I need to read it again? Or is that... And she has not finished. Just to double down, not a single customer has suffered any financial loss or fallen victim to a crime through misuse of the data. This outcome should reassure all of us about what a strong and fast and collaborative response can achieve. And most importantly, and relating back to the theme of this presentation, sorry, I paused because I really can't believe what I'm reading sometimes, but we were being transparent, open and honest, good. We were apologetic and accountable, good. I used 4 of those words in my presentation, which is great. And finally, we did more than any other company in a cyber attack before had done, and we did it much quicker. Oh, it's okay to laugh. I mean, and look, I'm not, I should be upfront and honest and say I'm not picking on any company in particular, but I feel personally quite disturbed reading that from someone who was legally responsible and had been given a special license to hold the personal and confidential data of many of us. And it then just does lead me to this broader question around, sorry, are we doing things right, and are we doing the right thing nationally in terms of cyber policy? And I'll drill down into a little bit more detail in this presentation and touch on, I think, some of the things that I come across in my day job, which, you know, I do everything from working with, you know, corporate clients through to quite a number of charities and organisations in the not-for-profit sector. And I just want to kind of provide a bit of a reflection on that, and also to encourage people to, if you feel as outraged as I am about what you just heard, to get involved in things like the cyber policy and strategy review that's coming up, the government is currently calling for submissions. So, if we sit back and no one says anything and we just accept that standard that we all walk past, which is what we just heard, then government policy will never change. And if government policy doesn't change, then there's very little that will then trickle down into those really important areas of personal data that are held now by many organisations. And I'll talk about my experiences with that shortly. So, firstly, and I would love to pick the brains of the audience about, what is driving this absolute rash of data breaches at the moment. I wrote a little research paper about 9 years ago where I calculated the cost of a data breach in Australia at the time, which was about $2 million. We did a lot of calculations, like with the telco company involved, wasn't Optus, by the way, what was the cost of trying to do password resets? I think they did 80,000 of them through their Philippines call centre. So we did quite a bit of detailed modelling work. It was costly. There was an initial stock market reaction, but then within a month, and this is something that we see time and time again, it's a paradoxical outcome, but there's often a bit of short-term market pain, but then I think the executive team think, hang on, if we just hold on, people will forget. The market has no memory beyond a week or so. So we'll get there. Don't panic. And then we'll go and do an interview and we'll say, actually, what we did was great and everything's cool and no one needs to worry, no panic. And then what changes? So it's about how, I think, for me, the challenge that we all face is how do we create that momentum for a change that will really ensure that people who hold very special offices like being a company director and sit on a board, how do we make them really sensitised to the significant responsibilities that they have? And, to be honest, I did a whole series of sessions a few years ago with the AICD and we travelled around Victoria and, we kind of start the presentation with, well, who knows anything about cybersecurity? And these are all directors and, the level of knowledge was relatively low, uncomfortably low. Some councils, I think up in Albury, it was almost the opposite. They had this crack team that would go onto social media and identify graffiti tags and then pass the information on to police. And I'm like, guys, you've got it, So what are we doing at the national level? Well, every 4 years for the past 10 years or so, we've had this cybersecurity strategy which has come out. When the new government came in last year, they said, scrap that, we're going to start again. And then some of the people on the new panel are actually identical to the people on the old panel. And if you do a top-level heading comparison between the new consultation paper and the previous two strategies, there's a fair bit of overlap, I think it's fair to say. So fresh thinking, the only way we're going to get it is if we actually speak up and say something. So again, I encourage you again, we are going to, as a company, we're going to not just put a submission in, we're going to release it as well and get the conversation going. So by all means, don't agree with what we say, please put in your own. And I think it is really, really critical for government to hear many, many voices on these really important issues. I think related to the data breach, issue is, it's really around what are we trying to protect? What are the goals with the cyber program? How do we go through a process of working out what we should be focusing on and what we can not worry about? I think what I see in some of my work is that there's, outside of the sort of specialist cyber area, particularly in ICT, there's often a real lack of awareness of what people on the cyber side of things are actually doing, apart from paying thousands of dollars for certifications several times a year. Not me, by the way, I'm not a big believer, but many people do. And, really drilling down and saying, are we spending money in the right places, and are we spending it on the things that really matter? And to my mind, it's really the data that is held about us as people, which is really what we should be focusing on. There's a heck of a lot of throwaway data out there that we probably should never worry about. And, in an age of social media where people routinely disclose stuff about themselves, what is that balance and the consequential obligation on corporations to then identify and work out what they should be protecting? So I'm not saying it's easy, but I do think that there's a certain level of naivety about the goals of a cyber program. And it's something that, sometimes, there's a requirement for people to put in place a cyber program. So I'm working with a company at the moment who work with defence, and so as part of their engagement, they have to achieve a certain status with defence, and at the end of the day, they kind of got no choice, because if they want to keep the contract going forward, they have to comply. But lots of companies, we've got the Privacy Act and other things, but we don't really sort of have this overarching set of legislation or regulation that says this is specifically your obligations about cybersecurity. And I think that is very confusing for companies. And I think related to pursuing those security goals is, what are the values? Really our national values that we hold about data. I had a bit of a brainstorm, and it took me about 30 seconds, and I thought these were kind of the 5 that really jumped out at me. Particularly things like fairness and openness. But, I guess a lot of things around cyber tend to be very secretive by their nature, but sometimes I think unnecessarily so. And I'll come to an example later on where I talk about, people who want to standardise and say, yep, I'm compliant with the standard. Well, hang on, to even look at the standard, you have to pay a licence fee, and before you even know what you're looking at. And so we kind of come back, I think, in some ways to the whole open source movement, I've got to say, in my kind of thinking. So if you have a very narrow kind of closed private fee-paying standards committee versus one which reflects the views of the community, I think, looking back at my first question, this is definitely one of the issues that's driving data breaches. Okay. So, and hopefully, by the end, people might have reflected on what their values are and what our values should be around data as a nation. So hopefully I'm going to sketch out some of those kind of ways forward. Actually, I did this little screen mock-up before we had the quote from the Optus CEO. So, but I think it does, look, I don't know. I don't know what to say, really. It's kind of shocking to me, but let me move on to something which I do want to talk about. So, was anyone here affected by the Optus data breach? Yep, a few, yeah. Okay, well, now we come to the one that I was affected by, which is Medibank. Okay, so let me tell you a bit of ancient history. Back in about 2001, when I was a government employee, I signed up for this thing called the Government Employees Health Fund, which at some point I stopped being a member of, and then Medibank took them over, and I ceased my membership in 2009. I actually went back and checked my email. And the reason I went back and checked my email is I got this message from Medibank saying, oops, sorry, we just lost your data. And I had never actually been a Medibank customer, and even for the corporate entity, I hadn't been involved with them for 13 years. So I'm kind of left thinking, who made the decision to put my data on the internet or make it accessible for an attacker in such an easy way when I hadn't even been a damn customer for 13 years? So again, I mean, it really raises basic questions around who in a company decides what data is collected, under what conditions, where is it stored, what are the protections, what are the proportionate protections for different classifications of data within the organisation, how long is data retained, when is it thrown away, how is it thrown away, and so on and so forth. I mean, it seems to me this is a really basic set of questions, but I'm sure if I went to most companies and said, who makes that call, there'd be multiple people pointing their fingers at each other. CIO saying, well, that's a CTO, that's like, I don't know, a librarian, or that's an IT problem. IT says, well, it's probably a cyber thing, so, and they'll say, well, maybe it's a compliance function, let's ask the lawyers. And sometimes, I mean, this stuff just goes around and around. And the longer it goes around and around, when the tyre hits the gravel and you get a breach, then this is kind of what we're left with. So yes, this is definitely my impression that we've got this safe and everything's safe, but maybe it just didn't really turn out like that. So I've actually joined one of the 2 class actions that's being launched against Medibank. I certainly don't expect $1 million. But, there's, I guess, given the data that can be used to assume my identity and then to go on to commit fraud, I mean, for 10 million customers, I've got to say, to my mind, this is probably the most significant national issue in cyber we've ever faced. And I don't think the understanding is still there yet, I think, both in the corporate sector and government, about what the risks are, with effectively half the population being up for identity theft from just one attack. So it is really, really significant and quite worrying. But if I get $1 million, I'll be thankful to you all for your support. So the discussion paper that has come out, again, these are kind of the top level headings, none of which are bad, I've got to say. Public-private mechanisms and partnerships, threat sharing, wonderful. Building the skills and talent pipeline. It's been in the last 2 strategies. I have myself been heavily involved in some of those initiatives, particularly through the OS Cyber Project Fund. I worked with a little organisation called Genius Armory, where we try to create training materials to encourage people on the autism spectrum to get involved in cyber. That is free, by the way. If you know anyone who might be interested, please jump on and register them, get them involved. We actually have a national skills crisis in cyber. For those of you who try and hire cyber people from time to time, you'll know what I'm talking about. And we have something like a 30% annual churn rate in cyber teams, which is just... I won't talk about that today because it's very frustrating, but absolutely want to support this kind of stuff. National frameworks. Well, we have the Essential 8. Do we need the Essential 16, or could we just use international frameworks like NIST, or is that just a US government one, or ISO 27001? Oh, hang on, it will cost you $120. Anyway, let's not go there. I'll come back to that. Investing in the ecosystem, I just love this stuff. But there's a big problem. And I challenged myself. I read the thing and I thought, I read this and I just feel really warm and fuzzy inside. But I then went through with my little find function and I said, okay, I'm going to do a bit of a frequency count. How many times does it mention the word firewall in this document? 0. Anything to do with endpoints? SOCs? I don't know, AV products? 0. Any mention of any operating system at all? Nothing. What about the operational side? Teams, red teams, blue teams? Nope, completely silent. And given I think some of the discussion last week about should we reintroduce the Australia card and link every government service together again, and that's going to be the solution to all this stuff and make it go away, and national centralised identity management, not a mention in the discussion paper. So I don't know about you, but when I read a strategy that is disconnected from the implementation so radically and completely ignores it, how can I say it nicely? There's a gap. Let me just say, I was going to say something rude, but I'll just say that there's a gap. There's a gap, I think, between what people in this room would understand the actuality of protecting data to be versus the idealisation from the panel at this stage. So please, 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 please set them straight, send them a one-word submission to say, where is the firewall, question mark, or where is the cryptography, or, you know, where is the compliance frameworks, where's the legislation, you know? But unfortunately, I'm a bit disappointed with it. I mean, it really, but it's not finalised, right? So that's the consultation paper. We can change this. So the thing about data is that, you know, data is important to all of us, but, you know, it has a market value. People are buying and selling data because data can be used for identity theft and identity fraud, as I mentioned before. So unfortunately, we've got something there that is so easy to steal. The temptation is very high, and with the lack of concrete mechanisms to bring people to justice who actually steal this stuff, you know, we've got to do two things. We've either got to try and, you know, reduce the value of that data somehow, or just make it really hard to get in the first place. Now, if there's one thing I've learned over many years in working with companies in cyber, it's pretty rare that I go into a company and they say, we'll give you a blank check. Right? You just tell us what the cost is and we'll just do it, you know. Typically, it's, you know, it's just, it's more like this is on the cost side of the business. Our quarterly profit results are coming up. What's it going to cost us? Because then we have to remake that money again. In the charitable space, and this is where, yeah, honestly, I do get a bit heartbroken at times. You know, I did an assessment last year, and you know, we talked about costs and things, and this was for a charity that, among other things, provides, you know, beds for homeless people. And so what they said was, sure, we accept that we need this thing, but I want you to really think about, do we have to put 10 people out on the street tonight, or could we shrink it down so we only put 5 people out? You know, and it's pretty harsh, and you know, but the consequence of them having a breach, and what we sort of uncovered through our discovery was they actually held quite a lot of data about children who were under various court orders and things, and in different types of state care. And at that stage, they really had nothing in place to protect that data. So to protect the 395, 5 had to go without a bed. I mean, I think that's the consequence of what we're really talking about. So it is really sad, but it is something that, you know, in that conversation we talk about, well, with your budget next year when you go back to funders, particularly government, you just need to have the line item that says, you know, we are serious about protecting the data of vulnerable people. And I said, really don't think you're going to have much argument. But it's not something that people have consciously been building in up until now, I think. So, you know, you can't protect everything, and it's not necessary to do so. And as I said before, like with social media and so on, it's really about, I think, backtracking from the data that can be used for things like identity theft and identity fraud, or where the disclosure of that data is going to be embarrassing or in some ways dangerous for people. And so, with some of the Medibank data, for example, that was disclosed, I mean, it was pretty awful. It wasn't just identity data. I mean, there was a range of highly personal medical records that were completely released with full identifying information. And again, I really feel for the people who've had to go through that disclosure. And then, of course, the consequential scam phone calls and things, which I'm sure have been a part of that. So are we chasing this fool's paradise where we can't keep things secret in the first place? I mean, I looked at a few graphics around privacy versus confidentiality, and it was all about privacy is about people, but confidentiality is about data. And then I thought, but what about personal data that is also private but needs to be confidential? And at the end of the day, I thought, there's probably nothing blanket that you can really say about it, except that every company and organisation needs to go through a process where they classify that data and assess the risk in terms of disclosure. But, there are also kind of numerous tools, I think, that that we can bring to bear to try and shape the way that we not just respond to data breaches, but to try and prevent them in the first place. And so this is a really great matrix, which if you've never seen before, this is the situational crime prevention framework. And it's sort of hard to summarise because there's 25 different strategies. I can't remember them all, but really across 5 high-level dimensions. So increasing the effort, increasing the risks, reducing the rewards, reducing provocations, and removing excuses. And so I think where we see, say, CEOs making excuses, then it's something that we have to push back on and say, well, we don't need excuses, we need explanations, but what could have been done to prevent this in the first place? And of course, classic kind of blue team engineering stuff down the left, how do we harden the target? How do we implement access control? How do we screen data going out? I mean, data exfiltration. I mean, there's technologies around to detect this kind of thing, deflection and so on. No smart guns, I've got to say, but this is just a generic list of things. But increasing the risks, like having better guardianship and kind of custodianship of data, I think is really important. As I talked about before, kind of reducing those rewards, making sure that people can't make as much money out of it as they hope to. And, I guess other kind of things around, reducing provocations may be a little bit less relevant in this context. But I actually think this is a great tool, generally speaking, but certainly really relevant to data breaches. So values I kind of talked about before, and I guess in many of the previous talks that have gone on today, I think we've seen some of these come to the fore. So, the idea of many eyes kind of bringing their own perspectives and having that kind of open peer review, assumptions and things being actively challenged, code being looked at, standards being looked at. One of my long-time collaborators when I was an academic, Joseph Pieperzik, caused a bit of a kerfuffle when the AES encryption standard was implemented because he devised an algebraic attack which showed that, theoretically of course, but with some high score algebra, that you could reduce the search space very, very significantly. And I've got to say, he didn't win any popularity points. I mean, I suspect he was deeply unpopular with standards bodies for a while because they'd had this competition and invested a lot of money. There have been implementations, pushing this stuff out, saying it's gazillion times more secure, and, well, maybe it's only a third of a gazillion times more secure. And with the advent of quantum computing and so on, and, you know, it just kind of, set the cat among the pigeons. But I guess that's the point about having an open process for review and so on, that those kind of things will be caught. Fairness. I think one of the things that I'd like to put in our submission to the government is, particularly in things like the charitable sector, you know, we can't leave an entire sector behind because they want to devote all their money to the particular service that they're trying to provide. So can the government really stump up and provide, you know, cold, hard cash or a direct service for the sector? You know, you think about, say, a domestic violence shelter, women's refuge, this kind of entity, the privacy of the data for their clients is really, really important. And, you know, I don't know how people could sleep at night thinking that, hey, we've done nothing to really try and address that situation. And so, you know, with our NFP partner Workventures, which is Australia's longest running ICT charity, this is something that we are really urgently seeking to try and address, and to provide those services where they are absolutely needed. That's not to say for some of the really huge national charities who are turning over hundreds of millions of dollars a year that they can't afford cyber services. But at the local level, initiatives that are primarily volunteer run, but provide critical protection for some of our really vulnerable people in our community, it is really important. Transparency. I think it's actually quite good at the moment because, you know, we do have a notifiable data breach scheme, which, you know, we all get notifications, which is good. I do wonder whether some of these things are not covered up, whether those discussions aren't being held to say, hey, there's only 3 people in the room know what actually has gone on, maybe we can just... But the proposed penalty scheme, I think, is going to, you know, greatly increase the fines which can be levied. So, you know, I think having that honest conversation with your customers, with people that are affected, is really important. The opposite is also true, having a less than genuine conversation and saying everything's cool, it just doesn't cut it, I think. Collaboration, sharing intelligence, not seeing security and data that you have about threats as some kind of fiefdom. I've got to say, I spent 6 years as a research director trying to encourage collaboration in our finance and banking sector and sharing data, and I absolutely wore out many, many pairs of shoes, knocking on doors and so on, and sadly got absolutely nowhere. So I can say that from experience, that is something that I think we have to learn about collective security, that, you know, a threat to one of us is really a threat to all of us. And, you know, a customer with one entity is probably also a customer with other entities. So if you're protecting your customer, you need to take that holistic viewpoint. And finally, the question I think that nobody wants to really answer, we spend a lot of money on cyber, on defences broadly speaking. Is it actually making any difference? And how would we know? And who's responsible for actually going out and doing that kind of analysis and reporting? We are soon apparently going to acquire not just 1 but 2 sets of nuclear-powered submarines. And I don't want to say anything controversial, but, you know, it's a lot of money. And it's a lot of money from a fixed budget that will be taken away from other budgetary line items at the federal level that provide funding for hospitals, schools, cancer treatment. Sorry, ma'am, no radiotherapy for you today because we had to buy another submarine, you know. And that's just the reality of a budgetary process, right? But I do think it's really important for cyber to really be clear about the outcomes that can be achieved and what is actually realistic. So values, I think, is really important, and I'm not going to pick on any particular country. I'm going to give just two examples in these infographics. So, you know, does cyber and protecting our data mean the government looking at every packet of data that we store or transmit? You know, and I'm kind of thinking of the Snowden kind of scenario where it's just a big Hoover and it just goes into a black building somewhere and there's no oversight, there's no control. And of course, I've got friends who say, if you're doing nothing wrong, you don't need to be afraid. Trust us. Okay, just chucking it out there is, and I've got to say, I don't have all the answers to these questions, by the way, but is this approach consistent with our values? Okay. Here's another example that we find from a federal government national level. You know, I've got to say, back in the day when I used to travel a lot in China, you know, I never felt unsafe on the street. You know, I knew that I could walk around at 1 o'clock in the morning after a few hearty ales at my local pub and have absolutely no issue at all in terms of public safety, personal safety. Yet to achieve that, there is this vast collection of data about every aspect of personal life which goes into a big algorithm, and what comes out of the algorithm is your score, and if you are scoring in a pro-social manner, it's all good, but I don't know, if you have a bad day or everything just all happens to go wrong at once, then there's this kind of cumulative effect. So again, that notion of large-scale surveillance isn't what we want. You know, if you use your Alipay card to buy a fish and chips 2 days in a row, your score might begin to drift, because of course that's going to have long-term consequences for public health budgets if you do that 2 weeks, 2 years, 20 years. So what are the kind of limits to government looking at this stuff, I think is really important. Okay, so final slide, and definitely don't want to hold anyone up from going to their dinner, but you know, I think it is this big question for me around how do we build a values-based approach to cyber at the national level, one which really takes into account those values. I'd love to hear if other people have got ideas around values, because if we don't have values, then what do we have? You know, we probably have oppression, which I think is the likely outcome. You know, when I look at the vast array now of cybersecurity frameworks, you know, there are very few that are genuinely open and transparent and freely available and adaptable. I think in the way that we see code being written and shared and transmitted. I'm not sure why this is, but, you know, as I said, like, I mean, there's sectors like the charitable sector that actually A, can contribute really valuable use cases that are probably unique, but B, I mean, just don't have a lot of budget to be going and paying for this stuff themselves. You know, at the national level, I think we need strategies that can facilitate data sharing and reporting. You know, we can't go around arresting everybody literally because they're probably in a foreign country in many cases. So it's difficult to go and use traditional policing. But at the same time, you know, it's very easy to get on a path to say, let's just lock everything down and lock everybody up because that will solve the problem. And I think that would really be contrary to our values. Do I think CEOs and board members should go to jail if they lose 10 million of our most personal data records? Can anybody guess what my answer is going to be? Yeah, you need an effective deterrent. Think back to situational crime prevention. You know, corporations hold a very, very special type of license to operate in the way they do in our society, and part of that needs to be accountability at the end of the day. We need monitoring, you know, and we need monitoring of the things that are our crown jewels. And I think when we do assessments, we often talk about crown jewels. And I truly do think that we need 24/7 continuous monitoring of those crown jewels to make sure that we're not going to have another Optus or Medibank. And I really hope that we don't. But at the same time, you know, I don't want us to go down this dystopian path of centralised governments controlling every aspect of our lives, all of our data, because of course when you bring all that together, it just becomes another target, because the value is going to be even greater when all that data is brought together. So, you know, MyGov 2.0, I think that's some of the discussions at the moment, single, you know, kind of centralised identity management. I'm not sure. So why not decentralise it? You know, why not get a range of organisations involved in things like IDAM? It doesn't just need to be the government. And that's basically it. Thank you.
Yep, we got some time for questions. So anyone? Yep. Okay.
Thanks for the talk. I spoke to my local government, like my council, the other day. I was applying for a grant for something, and they needed to check my address. And I said, "Well, I'm a ratepayer. Can you just check in your rate?" And they said, "No, we're actually not allowed to do that. We're not allowed to compare across, you know, data like that." And I was super impressed. Like, and
That's good.
So how can we translate that sort of maturity about personal information across to corporate entities whose shareholders only really care about profit? Like,
Look, and I think that's where, you know, it's got to be concretised, and I think, you know, it's got to be real, you know, and I think where we see that 40,000 foot view of what data protection really means, it's just way too in the clouds. But coming up with templates and models and policies and procedures through some kind of clearinghouse, for example, that says, I don't know, we've got a community of lawyers that sit around on the weekend and just check stuff because they think it's important to the community. I mean, I think that's the kind of thing that we need, and that would really boost compliance, I think. I think not having an overarching piece of cyber legislation that clearly spells out obligations is not helpful. Privacy Act is great. I think removing some of the small business exemptions for Privacy Act is also good, but it's also then going to reduce profits for a lot of small businesses. If I think about, I don't know, my local tradies, you know, how they're going to juggle doing their tradie stuff with, hang on, I've got to think about APP 2 and 3 when I take down someone's data in my little iPad, or, you know, write it on the back of an envelope and so on. So I think it's really breaking it down to a really granular level, you know, coming up with artifacts that people can actually use, software that people can use, that is actually compliant and complete and usable. I mean, that's what we need. Some of the cyber software is extraordinarily expensive, and it's proprietary and probably not even fit for our local conditions because it's all done offshore. I mean, that was one of the things that I think in the previous strategy there was a heavy emphasis on kind of seeing cyber as an economic boost. That is still there a little bit in this proposal, but, you know, AustCyber, for example, as the government-funded entity for innovation in cyber, has essentially been folded into Stone and Chalk. So And someone did ask me recently, how many Australian, made commercial products do you use in your cyber daily activity? And I said, well, actually none. So, which is sort of sad, but it doesn't mean that there can't be activity in the community which is not necessarily profit-driven, because we've all got a vested interest in seeing this work. So I think that's my challenge out to the open source community, is to look at what we've done in terms of the approach to code, and think about how we can broaden that out to this cyber area, particularly around standards and implementation.
Okay, so time is up, but do people want to ask more questions? Okay, so, so I think Paul's still around, right?
Yep.
So if you have any question, please approach him. And I think it's about time for today. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.